You're tuned in to the Goh Show, the official podcast of Andy Goh, owner and founder of Goh Studios in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm your host, Andy Goh. You could be tuned into any other podcast in the world right now, but you're right here with me, and I appreciate that. Welcome to the Goh Show. This is the official podcast of me, Andy Goh, and Goh Studios, the full-time podcast production and consultation firm of which I am the founder, owner, and as of this publishing, the sole employee. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to tune into my very first podcast that's purely of my own creation. Now, I want to point out that while this is the first podcast of my very own, this is far from the first podcast I've ever recorded, produced, engineered, mixed, mastered, published, or promoted. In fact, I've been publishing podcasts since 2014 or so. I got my start making podcasts when I had an idea to create an online independent radio station that played local music here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I still live today. It quickly became apparent that playing music, i.e., paying for licensing, could get pretty expensive pretty quick, even with smaller artists. So I turned to podcasting as a way to create original content without having to pay the huge fees. While the radio station didn't end up panning out, I stuck with the podcasting. I continued to work on a few podcast projects. One of them was Final Round Radio. This was a disc golf podcast that my co-host and I created 117 episodes of from 2015 through 2018. At its height, we were one of the most popular disc golf podcasts around, talking to top players like Paul McBeth, Simon Lizotte, and Ken Climo, and traveling to places like Boston, Dallas, and Athens, Georgia to cover tournaments. During this time, I was working full-time doing digital marketing at the Beckler Museum of Modern Art here in Uptown Charlotte. As strong as Final Round Radio was, it couldn't survive all the other things going on in our lives, and it currently sits in kind of a digital carbonite, frozen in time in the same pose since May 2018. Again, even while that project stalled out, I ended up collaborating with other friends and colleagues on podcast ideas of their own. One of the sessions turned into Crush This Debt, a podcast from my friend Bernadette Joy, who used the podcast to tell her story of paying off eye-popping debt in relatively short order, and has since turned that project into a full-time brand of its own. Another project was On Life and Meaning, a limited series of 100 separate episodes featuring writer, teacher, and perpetual intellectual Mark Perez, speaking to some of the brightest minds in Charlotte. That podcast and the original essays Mark wrote for each of his guests was eventually turned into an award-winning book. I also got to work with Charlotte Magazine on the Discuss CLT podcast, where we looked at many of the week's most important topics. Podcasts from my friends Nisha Pai and Stacey Brown Randall, who are still clients today, also helped me build my base of business. Of course, I can't forget to mention Matt Olin and Tim Miner, who hired me to help them produce podcasts for Creative Mornings long before Charlotte is Creative was a twinkle in their eyes. Probably one of the best decisions I made in the time leading up to me going out on my own was teaching for Skill Pop. Skill Pop is a series of hands-on classes taught on a variety of topics by local experts. Shortly after their founding in 2015 here in Charlotte, I emailed founder Haley Bohan about teaching podcasting. From that point on, I've been teaching classes to hundreds of students about how to get their podcasts up and running. Skill Pop has helped me become more of an expert in my field by having me teach to classes of 10 to 15 different people night in and night out, while also providing me with the opportunities to find new clients. I really can't underscore enough the importance of Skill Pop in getting me to where I am today. I'd had this idea of going out on my own full-time for my podcast business for several years at this point. Leaving a steady paying job with health insurance and a 401k for a life of relative uncertainty is absolutely not an easy decision. There's many ways you can lose a lot of money for many years trying to make a business happen, and there are all of less than zero guarantees that you're ever going to get any of that money back. This world, for the most part, isn't really designed for you to color outside of the numbers from a job perspective. Despite the risks, the allure of being a business owner and creating something that's not only economically viable, but personally and professionally fulfilling was too much for me to turn down. Thanks to a decent amount of savings from having worked my W-2 job for several years, I was able to officially start my business, Goh Studios, on January 1st, 2019. Since that time, I've been honored and blessed to have been able to work with some really fantastic people and organizations in and around Charlotte. I partnered with the Arts and Science Council to help promote the then proposed quarter-cent sales tax to support arts funding. Now, the tax didn't end up passing, but the content of the podcast is something I'll be forever proud of. I also took a trip to McAllen, Texas with members of the United Methodist Church to capture their work at a migrant respite center on the Mexican border. The experiences I had there are things that will stay with me for the rest of my life. I've also gotten to work with other Charlotte-based organizations like Opera Carolina, Caring, Charlotte Works, Compass Group, and Digital Charlotte. I've been able to work with passionate solo podcasters who are architects, scientists, theater aficionados, actors, Instagram influencers, and other entrepreneurs. I've also recently launched podcasts for Hilliard Studio Method and Dorier Underwood, a local leadership development firm. I've also gotten to travel to Cleveland, New York, Los Angeles, and Asheville for projects or conferences. All of this in 17 months as a full-time business owner, and I haven't had to go back and get a 9-to-5 job. Now, I'll spend a longer episode in the near future talking about how rewarding being a business owner can be, despite the myriad of challenges. But for now, all I can say is that I feel incredibly lucky to be in this position where I have my own business, I chart my own path in life, and every single day I wake up and bet on myself. So why am I doing this podcast? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The cynical answer is that I got tired of telling people I make podcasts and then having them ask me what my podcast is about, and then me sheepishly telling them I don't have a podcast of my own. I just make podcasts for other people. See how much time it took just to explain it right there? That's why. But also, from a business perspective, I don't feel like I can be telling my clients to do this if that's not something I'm modeling myself. Producing a podcast also gives me an arena to which I can experiment with all the fun new things happening in podcasting, allowing me to pass along the most informed advice to them down the road. But the core reason is that it's an opportunity to create. I'm a creative at heart, and I need something that I can create. This podcast serves as something that I can mold, curate, and guide the evolution of over time. I probably spend way too much time thinking about the things that I can podcast about and too little time actually doing it. So this outlet is almost necessary for me to be able to function properly. Okay, but what can you expect from subscribing to this podcast, which, by the way, you should go ahead and do so right now on your favorite podcast platform of choice if you haven't done already? Well, the answer to that isn't so straightforward. This won't be a podcast about podcasting as one might assume it would be. I'll talk a healthy amount of podcasting, and I'll be interviewing lots of people that I mentioned I've worked with, but podcasting won't be the exclusive topic. I really feel this will be more of a collage of different content. I'll spend a few episodes by myself talking about whatever topics are most important to me that day. This could be anything from sports to music to movies or whatever's happening around the world. You can bet I'll have some pretty solid interviews with people I find interesting as well. I'll also have more creative content that you'll want to follow along to hear first. I guess you could say this will be a bit of an audio playground. Nothing will be off limits, but I'm going to try and have fun with this every time we publish. I want this to be a way for you to connect with me both personally and professionally. And just like me as a person, this podcast will be very diverse. One of the things I enjoy most about podcasting is this is quite possibly one of the most democratic instruments we have available to us as everyday people. With it, we have the opportunity to create a platform that can reach millions of people around the world with just an internet connection. And on that platform, we have no producers, we have no editors, and we have no writers telling us what we can or cannot say, as we occupy those roles ourselves. That allows us to share our stories, our areas of expertise, and our deepest passions as fully as possible with the other people in this world who share them as well. Podcasting also rewards authenticity. Podcast isn't trying to push you into the next click, swipe, or scroll. Podcasting wants you to slow down, take your time, and invest in a story or an idea. The more fully you can embrace your passion, the deeper the connection will be with your audience. So that's my goal. My goal is to be authentic and share my stories with whoever wants to hear them. Now, maybe that's just my mom, who I know is listening to this. Love you, Mom. But maybe it's just a few close friends. Maybe it's just my clients. Or maybe it's somebody I don't know personally who's taken the time to get to know me and my business by listening to this podcast. Regardless, I'm grateful for anyone who listens, because when you're listening to this podcast, you're investing your time into your relationship with me. And that's something I can't ever take for granted. Okay, you've heard enough from me for now. Go to your podcast player of choice right now, smash that subscribe button, leave a review, even if you think this episode sucked. And if you really hated it, please make sure you put it all over social media so everyone else can listen and hear for themselves. That's it for the show, everyone. My name's Andy, and I'm saying drive home safe, be great every day, tell your loved ones that you love them. I'm out! That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor and subscribe to the Goh Show on your podcast platform of choice. Give us an honest rating and a review. It really helps the podcast appear in other people's feeds and searches. Follow me personally on Twitter @AndyGo and on Instagram @TheGojo. You can find Gojo Studios on both platforms @Gojo Studios. Shoot me your comments and questions about today's episode or whatever you want to see in a future episode to andy@gojo.com. Finally, check out gojostudios.com for all the latest. The Goh Show is created, written, recorded, edited, mixed, mastered, produced, and promoted by Andy Goh of Gojo Studios. Music by Harvey Cummings.